everyone, it's Sevy. In my recent team comp videos, Sucrose has been a common factor as a strong and extremely good value 4-star Anemo unit. I personally think investing in Sucrose is almost a must, whether for the early or late game. So to help you with that, this is my updated build guide for our sweet little alchemist. I'll talk about Sucrose's talents and kit, gameplay, constellations, best weapons, artifact builds, and team comps. Let's begin. Sucrose's role consists of different support utilities. She shares elemental mastery to her teammates, crowd controls enemies, and can enable reactions for teammates. And as an Anemo unit, she holds the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer to shred enemy resistance. All these indicate a support role, but we also shouldn't ignore that Sucrose is also a potent source of damage via swirls and reactions she triggers. Let's go through all her different talents and see how they contribute to her overall kit. First is her normal attack talent. Sucrose deals Anemo damage in rapid succession. Given how Sucrose's attack is not really what you're building, plus the talent multipliers of her normal attacks, don't expect much from its damage. But despite these, there's a good reason to use her normal attacks, which is for swirl damage and driving your team's abilities. Since they deal Anemo damage and Sucrose's attacks are relatively quick, she can do fast procs of swirl. Then you can continuously proc, which we also refer to as driving, teammate abilities that need to be triggered by doing normal attacks, such as with Xingqiu's Rain Swords or Beidou's Chain Lightning, which at the same time gets swirled. It's quite an effective combo. Sucrose's skill and burst are really where her kit's strengths are, but don't underestimate what her normal attacks can add. Now for her skill. Casting it procs an Anemo suction in front of her. At C0, you only have one charge with a long cooldown, but this is remedied a lot by getting C1 or equipping sacrificial fragments, which I'll discuss later. Anyway, her skill is the main source of her damage. It deals Anemo damage, which spreads and swirls any elements affected in its field. For light and small enemies, they'll also get pulled in the suction, which helps crowd control mobs. It can also pull in certain droppables from your teammates like Guoba or Aloy's bombs. If you hit at least one enemy, this will generate 4 particles, which can either be to battery Sucrose or another teammate. The best way to use her skill is by swirling multiple elemental aura sources in order to do many instances of reaction damage. For example, one of the best ways we can see this in action is in the Sukokomon team, swirling Pyro, Electro, and Hydro together. If done correctly, you'll see a lot of colorful numbers and reaction prompts on screen. Very satisfying indeed. One more thing that makes this skill so good is that the different charges have no ICD. What this simply means in practice for Sucrose's skill is that casting charges right after another means that it can proc swirl and reactions in all those casts. Now that's a lot of damage. In fact, all her talents also do not share ICD, which is why she can easily proc swirl with her entire arsenal. Then for her burst talent, using it releases a Crystal Fly avatar which deals Anemo damage every 2 seconds and then sucks in and launches enemies for crowd controlling. If it interacts with an element, it can infuse itself with that element and deal additional elemental damage. You'll see the color change accordingly. Her burst helps in creating more swirls and applying elements on your enemies. Now what happens if there are multiple elements to interact with? This is where you can learn about her element absorption priority. The highest priority is Pyro, followed by Hydro, then Electro, then Cryo, for short PHEC. So if you want to isolate a certain element to be absorbed, ensure that there's no other element that has a higher priority. So all in all, combining all these talents is what makes Sucrose such a potent swirler and reaction enabler. But she has even better added support utility via her passive talents, both of which are geared towards sharing elemental mastery with teammates. Her first passive, Catalyst Conversion, will trigger when Sucrose swirls one or more elements. Characters of the elements involved in the swirl reaction will gain 50 elemental mastery for 8 seconds. This can't be stacked, but still, it's a helpful boost for your team's reaction damage. Her second passive, Mollis Favonius, shares 20% of Sucrose's EM to all her party mates except herself when her skill or burst hits opponents, which is a very easy condition to fulfill. This passive is one reason why stacking EM on Sucrose is valuable, so that she shares as much EM as possible to the party, thereby further increasing your reaction damage. These passives are what makes Sucrose so valuable in reaction-based teams. Aside from Sucrose swirling and applying elements, she also supports her teammates to do higher reaction damage, thereby resulting in better total team DPS. What about her talent priority? It's important to know that Sucrose can actually be built without investing much into her talents because Swirl and other transformative reactions don't rely on talent levels for their power. If you only need Sucrose for triggering swirls and sharing elemental mastery, then there's no pressure to level them and you can save resources. If you do want to invest in her talents though, level up Sucrose's burst and skill alongside each other. You can level up her normal attacks if you use her a lot as an on-field driver as well. Moving on to her Constellations, Sucrose's Constellations really help in making her feel smoother to play and increasing her utility. Let's go through them one by one. C1 gives Sucrose a second charge on her skill. It's a bit tricky to play Sucrose without C1 since her skill is her main source of energy and DPS. As her first constellation, it's easy to unlock, but it offers a lot of value, making it one of the best C1s out there, I think. Having it should give you all the more reason to start investing in Sucrose if you haven't yet. C2 gives her burst 2 seconds longer duration, which is 1 extra pulse, a small bump in burst damage. C3 increases her skill level, and since that's where her non-reaction DPS comes from, it's a good constellation considering it's also boosted by C1 already. C4 is an interesting constellation. You can reduce your skill's cooldown by hitting the 7th hit of your normal attack and charged attack combo. Also, this hit counter doesn't reset when you switch her out, thankfully. The only downside is that the cooldown time reduced is randomized from 1 to 7 seconds. If you're using Sucrose as an on-field driver in DPS, then this constellation will be put to good use. But even if you're using her mainly for her skill, there's now more incentive to insert her normal attacks in between her rotations. However your playstyle with her is, this is a useful boost to her utility. C5 increases her burst level. An okay constellation, but perhaps not as impactful as her C3. C6 gives an elemental damage bonus for the element absorbed by your burst to characters with the matching element. As long as you can absorb the specific element, then it's an okay damage boost. These constellations help enhance her overall kit, but not having all or some of them should still not dissuade you from starting Sucrose. Now let's discuss building Sucrose. If you understand her kit well enough, you'll also know that an EM build is the way to go. We'll get through her weapon choices first, followed by her artifacts. For free-to-play options, there's the 3-star magic guide for its EM substat, the craftable Mappa Mare for its EM substat, and an elemental damage bonus that's still beneficial for Sucrose, and the Thrilling Tale. Even though the Thrilling Tales has an HP substat, Sucrose is a great user for it when she serves as a buffer. This way she's not only buffing EM, but the attack stat of your DPS teammate as well. TTDS is very cheap to build and easy to acquire, and it's a good investment even in endgame content. As for gacha weapons, let's start with the Sacrificial Fragments. It has an EM substat and has a chance to reset Sucrose's skill cooldown. If your Sucrose is already C1, having a Sac Frag means that sometimes you can use 3 skill charges in a row, which means lots of swirls and particles generated. Another gacha weapon is the Favonius Codex, giving Sucrose most of the ER she needs and letting her generate extra particles either for herself or teammates. This is still a good weapon to use if you don't have Sac Frag or Thrilling Tales, especially if your Sucrose is lacking ER from artifacts. Why not automatically go with the Mappa Mare or Magic Guide, which are EM weapons? Well, you're trading reaction damage and a small bit of shared EM for less energy problems, smoother rotations, and added battery support. So despite this being an ER weapon, I think there are valid reasons to still use the Favonius Codex. But overall, her usual builds will assume either a Thrilling Tales or Sac Frag. Now when it comes to Sucrose's artifact stats, the default goal is full EM main stats. Sucrose will have swirls and reactions with higher damage than her actual talent multipliers. So EM not only contributes to Sucrose's EM sharing from her passive talents, but translates very well into damage. Regarding her artifact sets, it's also straightforward. While in the early game, don't worry too much about artifact set bonuses and prioritize EM main stats first. But if you're lucky enough, putting on the instructor set for more EM or the exile set or 2-piece scholar for energy recharge isn't a bad idea. In the late game, however, your goal should be a 4-piece Viridescent Venerer, as the swirl damage increase and the resistance shredding mechanic is largely where her Anemo support utility and DPS potential lie. And just a reminder, swirl and transformative reactions do not crit. The ways to boost their damage are by increasing your character's level, increasing the EM stat, reducing the enemy's elemental resistance, or putting on artifact bonuses that increase specific reaction damage. As for the substats, EM and ER are your main priorities, followed by attack percent if you're lucky, and some crit rate as well if you're on Favonius Codex. Another important stat question is how much ER does she need? This depends on various factors: team comp and party members, enemy types and mobs, and constellations and weapon equipped. You also want to consider if you want to burst every rotation or if bursting every other rotation is fine. As a loose guide, my Sucrose with C1 and Sacrificial Fragments has 130% ER, and I found this to be adequate in almost all situations. If I had only 1 or 2 skill charges, that ER stat would go up much higher. Experiment with your Sucrose and adjust your ER accordingly to give you the smoothest gameplay and rotations. Finally, let's move on to team comps. Sucrose is a very flexible and useful Anemo support in most reaction-based teams. Since there are so many variations, I'll discuss more general team templates, and you can slot in characters depending on personal preference and availability. Starting with Vape and Melt teams, Sucrose is an excellent support for Vaporize and Melt reaction teams thanks to her resistance shredding and EM sharing. These teams consist of one Pyro, then either a Hydro or Cryo, and a Flex slot, and Sucrose. There are a lot of permutations for this kind of team, but Sucrose's purpose is more or less consistent. She's also a good team member for a variation of the ever-popular national team, comping Sucrose with Xiangling, Bennett, and Xingqiu. Since there are a lot of Vaporize reactions occurring in that team, you can imagine how Sucrose's EM amplifies such big numbers even more. Often, Sucrose will also make use of a Thrilling Tales in these teams to buff even more the DPS reacting the most. Freeze teams are another popular template in the game. However, given that EM doesn't help amplify its damage, Sucrose's EM sharing mechanics aren't used here. But at the very least, she shreds elemental resistance with the Viridescent Venerer set and still helps spread Cryo and Hydro elements for more consistent freezing. Other Anemos might be more suited to such teams, but Sucrose still works if you don't have any other option, just not to her full potential. Sucrose brings a lot to the table for electrocharged teams though, both as an on-field driver or as a quick swap support. As a driver, you want to pair her with 2 Electro units and 1 Hydro unit, preferably units that have good off-field elemental application. They will apply Electrocharged on enemies, and the thing about Electrocharged is it keeps both Electro and Hydro elements on enemies, which makes it easy to swirl them at the same time. Sucrose's auto attacks, skill, and burst can continuously shred resistance, double swirl Electro and Hydro, and keep proccing Electrocharged on top of all that. This team comp was primarily Sucrose, Xingqiu or Child, Fischl, and Beidou. Thankfully, more recent additions such as Kokomi, Ayato, and Yae give Taser teams more variations to work with. The only thing to watch out for with Sucrose as your driver is that she is pretty squishy and can get interrupted. If you do have Kokomi, or now Ayato, and you want to give your Hydro unit the field time, Sucrose operates just as well by swapping in to do her skill for swirling and generating Anemo particles, throwing out her burst, and swapping out. Then there's the now famous Sukokomon team, which is so called because it's Sucrose plus the Genshin Pokemon: Kokomi's Jellyfish, Xiangling's Guoba, and Fischl's Oz. Where previously double swirls were used, Sucrose in a Sukokomon team swirls 3 elements, resulting in more reactions galore. You've probably heard by now that Sukokomon has a strict rotation to follow, so I'll leave a link in the description to a guide for it. For Sucrose, she has to alternate her skills and auto attacks in order to abuse her swirling ICD, basically so that she can keep swirling as often as physically possible. Here she'll want a Thrilling Tales build to give the buff to Xiangling, but a Sac-Frag build is also okay for more skill swirl damage. Outside of Sucrose's EM sharing utility and resistance shred, we can also capitalize on her battery potential in a Xiao hyper carry team, especially if you have her at C1. In this case, Xiao is comped with 2 other Geo teammates, most likely Zhongli being one of them. Then Sucrose will act as your crowd control and Anemo battery. It's also better if you don't want to steal a party member from a team that needs them, like Bennett. But everyone, that's going to be it for this updated Sucrose guide. If there are other team comps that you like to play her in, do feel free to comment down below. I would love to know. If this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like. Consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already for more Genshin Impact guides and content, and I will see you all soon. Take care!